Page 307, continued. James Elroy, Elroy, Flecker, Flecker, 1884 to 1915. The best of Flecker's poetry is to be found in The Bridge of Fire, 1907, The Last Generation, 1908, 42 Poems, 1911, The Golden Journey to Samarkand, The Old Ships, 1915, The Burial in England and God Save the King, 1916, published posthumously. Flecker is essentially the poet of the East, dwelling lovingly in a world of oriental grandeur and magnificence. He was fascinated by the exotic novelty and elusive romanticism of the East, which he has depicted in one poem after another. Quote, "In my exotic poems, unquote, he says, quote, I feel that there should be a most vigilant humor in the pomp and parade of nicely chosen words, stop, unquote. The glamour and romance of the East is often ironically and non-seriously treated. Para. Flecker is the master of jeweled phrase and gem-like verse. He is a great and inspired artist, page 308, with words. He has full command over his language and versification. Quote, he delights in the very names of exotic things and distant places, and master as he is of dazzling phrase and supple rhythm, and he seldom fails to evoke an answering delight in the reader, stop, unquote, para. W. H. Davis, Davies, 1871 to 1940. W. H. Davis has immortalized himself through the autobiography of a super tramp, T-R-A-M-P, 1908. It was after the loss of a leg while attempting to board a train that he turned to poetry for a living and produced a few volumes of verses which at once caught the public eye and brought fame and recognition to the poet. Para. Davis is essentially a lyric poet. His lyrics are short and spontaneous. Most of Davis's poems are shorter than those of any other modern poet. Out of 400 poems in his collected poems, 270 are only of 3 stanzas or even less. His lyrics are characterized by spontaneity and simplicity. Para. Davis is a great poet of nature and rural life. He presents the sights and scenes of nature as well as the life of the innocent country people living in the lap of nature. The world of his poetry is a world of vivid description of natural beauty, of intense joy, a world of sunrises, cows and sheep, owls and cuckoos, butterflies and squirrels. Davis may not be very accurate and precise in his nature descriptions. He does not seek to portray nature with the eye of a scientific observer, but he communicates successfully his own joy in nature and inspires his readers with his own zest for nature. There is something infectious about the freshness of nature in his poetry. Quote, while Walter de la Mare, unquote, says Robert Lind, quote, has the genius for making us look on lovely things as though for the last time. Stop. Mr. Davis has the gift for making us look at them, as if to the first time. Stop, unquote. Para. There is a note of tender sympathy in Davis's poems for animals and children. He has a sense of the tramp's comradeship with the horse, the cow, the sheep, the cuckoo, and the butterfly. Davis may have his faults, but we like and enjoy his poetry for its very simplicity and artlessness. Para. John Drinkwater, 1882 to 1937. John Drinkwater's collected ponies, Ponies, show that he is an intellectual interested not in lyrics and songs but in elegiac, Elegic, and meditative verse. His poems exhibit his gravity and earnestness, his sanity and rigorous discipline. He is a self-conscious artist who writes in the quote, cold ink of thought, unquote, comma, rather than in the quote, red blood of a fired brain, stop, unquote. Quote, his work is always controlled in emotion and expression, stop. There is little of the furor, Furor, poeticus, Poeticus, comma, and his language and imagery shows him to be a deliberate, careful craftsman of rather limited gifts. Stop, unquote. His imagery shines not as a star or a flower, but like a jewel, a priceless gem of art. Stop, quote. He speculates, comma, meditates, comma, ruminates, comma, but only rarely illuminates, comma, other than as the glowworm illuminates himself and his own surroundings, stop, unquote. However, John Drinkwater will be remembered not for his longer, reflective poetry, but for his nature poetry. He represented and celebrated, quote, the English countryside, comma, its streams and pools and woods, comma, its bridges and cattle and flowers, comma, its shepherds and gypsies, comma, with a cultured pastoral fancy, untroubled by any urgencies, unquote, stop. Few modern poets equal Drinkwater in the appreciation of nature. Para. W.B. Yeats, 1865 to 1939. Yeats was an Irishman, but he takes his place among the great English poets of the age. His greatness as a poet is now an accepted fact. Tributes to his greatness have been paid from time to time by eminent poets and critics of the day. Thus, J.W. Beach calls him the finest of the British poets of the modern age, and Fraser, in his well-known book The Modern Writer and His World, claims for Yeats the position of a major English poet and ranks him with Donne, with Milton, and with Wordsworth, and considers him very much superior to Browning, to Tennyson, and to Arnold. Further, he claims that the poetry of Yeats would enjoy a greater permanence and a more enduring popularity than the poetry either of T.S. Eliot or of Ezra Pound, because it is more coherent and more traditional than that of his two great contemporaries. He is largely free from the fricks and weems, comma, the eccentricities and incoherent ramblings which characterize much contemporary poetry. Para. Bulk, variety and uniformity. For one thing, Yeats is great by virtue of the bulk and variety of his poetry, and critics agree that very few of his poems can be regarded as definitely inferior. His work is uniformly good, even though he writes on such varied subjects as ancient legend, mythology, folklore, politics, history, love, and he constantly makes new myths of his own. His creative range is immense. He writes with perfect ease and mastery on themes taken from every possible sphere of life, and a high standard of performance is maintained throughout. Page 309. Para. Early poetry. Sustained and continuous development of art and genius is the keynote of Yeats's poetry. The period of poetic activity in his case extended over 50 years, and during this period he was constantly becoming, maturing and growing different from what he was in the beginning. There is no sudden change or break in continuity, but a slow evolution, and the charms of the future are to be found in what has gone before. His early poetry is romantic, while the later one is realistic, both in theme and treatment. He began writing verse in the thinned-out, romantic, pre-Raphaelite tradition. His early poems are frankly escapist and are heavily overhung with pre-Raphaelite tapestry. The languorous, dreamy atmosphere of his early fairy world is accentuated by haunting, incantatory rhythms. It is a world of Celtic twilight, of vague, uncertain lights, and the imagery used is equally vague and subdued in color. The use of Irish mythology and folklore took all Europe by storm, and it had a rare fascination for those who were fed up with the hackneyed classical myths and legends. They became aware, says R.A. Scott James, of a new lyrical voice that had a fey quality, a wild tenderness, something which was wanting to their souls. Para. Later poetry. It is for this reason that Yeats has been called by Graham Hough, Hough, and others, quote, the last of the great romantics, unquote, comma. But he became dissatisfied with this romanticism and discarded it more and more as he aged. The turn of the century saw Yeats transform into a great 20th century poet from a 19th century romantic. His later poetry is characterized by stark, naked realism, even brutality and coarseness, and with a masculine vigor and force. In keeping with modern realistic trends, there is greater and greater approximation to speech, rhythms, and colloquial diction. Quote, natural words in a natural order, unquote, are the ambition of the poet. All verbiage and decoration, all superfluity is rigidly excluded, and his style acquires an almost Dantesque, Dantesque, to use the words of Edmund Wilson, terseness and epigrammatic force and sublimity. However, this barrenness of style and diction, this bony structure, is combined with a rare richness and complexity of content. Profundity of thought accompanies simplicity of form. The poetry of the rich and complex, the tower and the winding stair volumes is a majestic utterance which stimulates and lifts up the readers by its very urgency, intensity, and immediacy. Para. The clash of opposites. According to A.G. Stock, Stock, his poetry is a battleground for the clash of opposites. The antimonies of the human and the non-human, of the spiritual and the physical, the sensuous and the artistic, physical decay and intellectual maturity, the past and the present, the personal and the impersonal, power and helplessness are forever appearing and reappearing in his poetry. In the early poetry, such opposites are merely rendered, but in his later poetry, according to David Daiches, Daiches, there is also an attempt at reconciling them. Para. Symbolism. Yeats was a symbolist from the beginning to the end of his career, so that Arthur Symons regarded him as the chief exponent of the symbolist movement in England. In the early phase of his career, his symbols are elementary and had no obstacles in the way of the readers. Thus, a number of his early poems are organized round, quote, the rose, unquote, symbol, a symbol largely traditional and so easy to understand. But with the passing of time, his symbolism became more complex, personal and individual. The swan, the tower, the winding stair, the gyres, Gyres, etc. are the oft-recurring symbols of his later phase. The same symbol is used in a number of poems, but in a different sense. Yeats makes use of symbols to convey his inner sensations, his visions and trances, his mystic experience which cannot be conveyed in any other way. At their best, Yeats's symbols are highly evocative and suggestive. They account to a very great extent for the impression of exceptional complexity, richness and intensity produced by his later poetry. Para. Compression and intensity. With age and experience, Yeats acquired full command over his material and could move with perfect ease from one dissimilar concept to another. He could now enclose vast immensities within the span of a short lyric, and in this way widen the scope of the lyric. Thus, in the brief Leda and the Swan, the poet succeeded in compressing whole ages of history, from the remote antiquity down to the present age. The effect created is one of simultaneous compression and expansion, and this results in great aesthetic pleasure for the readers. In this way, his lyrics gain not only in richness, but also acquire the force of a personality, felt emotion. The admirable and effective poem, The Second Coming, owes its intensity to Yeats's prophetic vision. Page 310. Yeats as a meat maker. Clenth, Clanth Brooks, Brooks, regards Yeats as a great myth maker and his vision as, quote, the most ambitious attempt made by any poet of our time to set up a myth, unquote, stop. Richly gifted with a mythopoeia, mythopoeia, imagination, Yeats is forever finding analogies for the present and the personal in the past and the impersonal. In this way, the present is glorified, exalted, and imparted the universal significance of a myth. The commonplace thus acquires heroic proportions. In the very opening of Easter 1916, for example, we get the myth of Yeats's contemporaries coming out of the dead past to participate in the activity of the present. Yeats invents new myths, uses old ones in changed contexts, or invests them with new significance. Para. Obscurity. The charge of obscurity has sometimes been brought against Yeats. There is no doubt a vein of mysticism running through Yeats's poetry, and mysticism by its very nature is incapable of rational exposition. It certainly creates difficulties in the way of the readers, but this obscurity and difficulty results from profundity of thought and terseness of expression, rather than from any carelessness on the part of the poets. Yeats was a conscious artist who polished and repolished his verses and tried to say what he had to say beautifully, clearly, and musically. Like a true artist, he selects his words with reference both to their sense and sound. As time went on, he increasingly tried to conform as closely as possible to everyday speech. As an artist, he had the creative gift and the inward conviction, and his so-called arrogance arises from his assurance. Inspired with absolute artistic sincerity and integrity, he does not hesitate to express himself in a blunt, forthright manner. He may sometimes seem coarse and brutal, but his very brutality is an expression of his integrity of purpose. Para. Yeats as a metrical artist. Yeats was a great metrist who experimented with a variety of stanza and verse forms. He kept away from the verse liber, L-I-B-R-E, and other technical innovations of his day, but he used the traditional meters and stanza forms with consummate skill. He freed the English lyric from the tyranny of the iambic and manipulated the stress, pause and cadence of the long line with great mastery and self-confidence. The octosyllabic couplet he made particularly his own and brought out its full colloquial possibilities. He had a Donne-like command over stanza structures and made his stanza patterns correspond with the movement of thought and emotion. The sudden shifts in tone and mood, often within the same line, further indicate Yeats's affinity with Donne and his school. Para. Yeats's permanence, the voluminous literature that has grown round him, reveals the fascination he has exercised on all those who have cared to read him, and this is a measure of his greatness. Yeats had the creative gift, he had the inner conviction, he had wisdom, he had full command over his resources, and these are the very qualities and go into the making of a great poet. Passion, intensity, and fervor are the keynotes of the greatest poetry, and these Yeats has in ample measure. He may not be a Shakespeare, a Dante, or a Milton, but he must certainly rank with the greatest poets of all times. Yeats's permanence is beyond question. Para. The Images and Ezra Pound. Just before the First World War, there was a reaction against Georgian poetry, which was criticized as, quote, facile and loose, unquote, appealing to the layman and not to the intellectual. This reaction is represented by a group of poets who called themselves imagists, I-M-A-G-I-S-T-S, for their aim was to represent real life in images that were clear, precise, and exact. The founder of this school, T.H. Hume, H-U-L-M-E, 1833 to 1917, and his most illustrious disciple, Ezra Pound, insisted that, quote, poetry should restrict itself to the world perceived by the senses and to the presentation of its themes in a succession of concise, clearly visualized, concrete images, accurate in detail and precise in significance, unquote, stop. The images aimed, quote, at hard, clear, brilliant effects instead of the soft, dreamy vagueness or the hollow Miltonic rhetoric of the 19th century's tradition, unquote, stop. They defined poetry, quote, as the presentation of visual situation in the fewest possible concrete words, lightened of the burdens of conventional adjectival padding, and unhampered by general ideas or philosophical or moral speculations, unquote, stop. For the expression of their thoughts and emotions, they evolved new rhythm and laid particular emphasis on verse liber, a kind of loose versification which modulates in harmony with thought and emotion and does not follow any set rules of meter and versification. Verse liber provided them with unlimited freedom of expression. The new rhythms, page 311 of the Images, bore a close affinity to those of everyday speech and were quite different from conventional verse patterns. Para, Ezra Pound and Edith Sitwell are the two most original and prominent poets of this school. Their poetry is still read and enjoyed.